I was going physically for my bear spray, my big can of pepper spray.
Yeah.
But I needed something faster than that. So I just let out this big yell. And before the yell even reached in that nanosecond between releasing it and it being received, it was like, oh, damn, was that the right thing to be doing here?
Welcome to the Wild Dispatch.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Wild Dispatch. I'm Robin, and as usual, I'm back with more skills and stories from the wild. We have a returning guest today, Monroe Robinson. He was a fantastic guest before. Be sure to check that out if you have a chance. Go back. I can't remember the episode, but it's only maybe 8 or 9 episodes ago. Monroe and I have become friends since our last conversation. I've been lucky enough to head over to his house a few times to help with pressing apples to make apple cider and all kinds of other fun stuff. So I'm excited to get him back. This time, well, talking about his life, but also talking about the life of another man, Dick Proenneke. Now, we will explain a little more in this episode who Dick Proenneke is, but in a nutshell, he is a legendary homesteader who showed up in Twin Lakes in Alaska, I think maybe in the 60s. In the 60s, yeah, and lived with very primitive tools successfully for 30-something years. So we're going to jump into that episode in any second. But first, I should give a quick note to just say that if you happen to be enjoying this podcast, then please do all the things that people who enjoy podcasts do. Give us a follow. Maybe actually also set to auto download so that you're always up to date. That would be helpful as well. It gives us a little bump in the old numbers, which is always handy. It would also be lovely if you could leave a nice review or share it with someone who you think would enjoy the show. If you're enjoying it, it's probably a good chance someone you like also enjoys it too. So here's a big thank you to everyone who's already done that. And also, I want to give a big thank you to Monroe for today's stories and for all the fun and friendship we've been enjoying the last few weeks. Right, that's all for now. I think it's time for me to stop waffling. Here's Monroe.
We had an amazing thing. Just Christmas Day, we were took some friends down to where we hiked down at Spring Ranch.
Okay.
Down here.
Yeah.
And the time before we were down there, we found a new coyote that we had never seen before.
Oh, yeah.
A big man.
Oh.
Beautiful, beautiful animal. And so we went down there with our friends 4 days after seeing it, and there it was again. And we spent 3.5 hours with it.
Really?
The whole time.
So it was just hanging around in the same area?
It followed us.
Oh, it followed you?
Not aggressively.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
We made one major move during that time. We mostly sat and watched it. And halfway through our time there, we moved. And maybe 10 minutes after making that move, it made a move and came down and hung out 100 yards from us.
That's cool.
That was so neat.
Yeah.
It was still there, laying there watching us when we left. It caught a couple little rodents during that time.
Like gophers or something.
Yeah, it was really extraordinary.
Yeah, it sounds it.
Best time in my life with a coyote.
Wow. We've had some cool moments, me and my wife, actually we were talking about Joshua Tree just before, but over there, going for some evening walks, and we've had moments where we've seen like a jackrabbit go flying past us, and then another one, and then suddenly there's like a pack of 4 or 5 coyotes cruising through the whole area that we're in, and we just stood still, and they kind of knew that we were there, but they were just trotting through and doing their thing. It was quite an amazing experience.
Were they tracking the rabbits?
Yeah, they were heading in their direction, just moving through. Yeah, it was cool. I love those kind of moments. It's special. Should we chuck those on for a second and we can adjust the levels? I'm going to just turn this so that I can see the timer.
I can hear you.
I can hear you as well, loud and clear. Okay, so I'm going to turn that down a touch. And then... Okay, so me... Does that sound loud or is that okay?
No, that was okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Shall I ha you?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn you down just a touch.
Okay.
I think that's good.
Good. That's great.
Okay, great. Okay, so... I might just turn these a touch down. Okay, so before we get cracking, any thoughts or questions or things that you wanted to tell me?
No, I can't think of it. No.
Okay, just along for the ride.
Yeah.
Okay. There was something also that you told me before when we chatted at the apple pressing day, that you said you thought more about our previous chat, and there was an idea or a thought that you had that you wanted to kind of convey. Is that something that you want to talk about now, or we can talk about it a bit later?
I don't know that I even need to.
Oh, really?
Yeah, listening.
It sounded great, the thing you mentioned. It was talking about like the interconnectedness of nature, and I think that was kind of something that you were mentioning.
I could. Your first interview, I think I articulated around the edges enough of that I could live with it like it was. But I know what I was thinking.
What were you thinking?
Well, I was just thinking how that wanting to see bison and not being able to as a child, and then having a dream of seeing caribou that led me up to Alaska and counting as large a run of salmon as anybody's ever seen. That summer, I did make a connection between the numbers of salmon as being this thing, part of nature and part of what's happening here on Earth, and a connection to my fantasies of seeing large numbers of bison or caribou. From your interview, and then thinking about it afterwards, I was able to then say, well, in a way, my time working in the forest, my seeing the redwood stumps here, since that was what was here, and young trees, but it was the stumps, it was this connection to the old growth trees that really captured my inspiration here.
Yeah.
And is part of building this house, remodeling this house, and using old growth to do it. And tying that, feeling the connection between that and that youthful longing to be close to bison and large numbers of animals. So it's been really a lifelong fascination with the fecundity, the diversity and life here.
Yeah.
But it's also then been the driver of my speaking up for things in the environment, for not only my life living, going out and filming wildlife all those years that we were at Twin Lakes, videoing that, but here in working to change the management of the local redwood forest here is part of that whole longing to maintain and keep that vitality of the earth that was given to all of us. And I was once, I knew the mayor of Fort Bragg after he was mayor, and he was a really staunch, really supported the logging industry and the sawmills here. And sometimes I thought to the detriment of taking care of the forest. And I went up to him one time and introduced myself and said, I would really like to sit with you and have a chat about our ideas for the forest and the redwoods. And he says, oh, I know who you are. You're the one that is responsible for the sawmill in Fort Bragg closing, which is not true. One person doesn't have that sort of power, nor was I. I was one of many people who have spoken up for changing the management of the forest here so that there's more older trees in the forest, that we don't clear cut, that we have a buffer around the streams. And what I brought to that conversation was my connection to salmon and thinking the reason that the salmon crashed here are many, including way overfishing. Okay. But it included also what happened to the streams, and that there's no longer a spawning habitat, an on-land habitat for salmon to survive as eggs and little ones. And that part is the part that, until that's remedied, there never will be a salmon industry here. And so I tried to integrate that, speaking of the forest as something not only for trees but for salmon. And I also, I don't want the whole forest to be a park that nothing's taken out of. My dream is that this forest would have old growth trees that are still coming down 7 generations from now, that we rebuild that, and that people have the possibility of building beautiful things out of old growth wood like your wife Hanukkah is doing right now. Yeah. And that would be, and at the same time that there's a thriving salmon industry and steelhead fishing in the rivers that support all of that. So I'm not in favor of locking everything up and making a big park that nothing is taken out.
Nothing can be used, yeah.
No, I'm not that at all, but I've gotten labeled that way.
It's interesting. The world doesn't have to be kind of binary, black and white, the way that I think it's easy for people to perceive, right? Like, oh, if you're not believing that logging is great at all times, then that must mean that you think all trees should be saved.
Right, exactly.
It's funny you say that.
So all of that ties back into that fascination, that love of wanting to see bison as my first metaphor for what made me tick.
Yeah. I've got to say, I'm not very knowledgeable about the state of the salmon running along the rivers here, but I was actually at it's by Camp 20, Camp 1, the egg collecting station there. I happened to be there because I went on a long bike ride. It ended up being a lot longer than we initially planned due to the temptation of mushrooms and foraging them. But we ended up at the egg collecting station, and Jimmy, just through the corner of his eye, because he's a fly fisherman, he spotted salmon jumping. And that's the first time I've ever actually witnessed salmon jumping, I think. And that was wonderful. That's the Noyo River. And we quickly rode our bikes back around to the other side. And I got some great footage, which I'll try and I don't know if I would have put it up yet by the time this is out. But just that, like you were saying, seeing some of those things, right. I feel like it does have an influence on your perspective on the world. Like seeing those salmon, amazing, some of them enormous, and it being after a significant rain, powering through this really, really torrid section over the concrete dam, and just the effort that they're putting into just kind of shallow water that they're moving through,
right?
Using their whole, everything they've got to try and get up over through. It was quite remarkable to see that, and we watched for a while. Probably ended up being quite late home in the dark, but it was worth it. It was just kind of a thing. We were both late already, and we were like, we've got to just watch this for a while.
Right.
This is amazing.
Yeah, I've talked to people my age, even a little younger than I am, who talked about seeing. Then they used that term that you've heard, salmon so thick you could walk across their backs in Hare Creek and the creeks and rivers around here in their youth.
Wow.
Which wasn't literally true, but
yes,
it speaks for a large number of fish. And that's what I described my being on the Kvichak in 1965 about, that you could say that same thing. You couldn't motor across the river without hitting fish.
Yes.
Yeah, so when the forest industry here loves to point out what bad forestry practices those early loggers were, dragging all the logs right down the creeks and all the mud and silt and stuff, and that they have much better practices now. And yet, if you think about people my age seeing salmon really thick in the rivers, then that was already at the end of that really destructive logging period. That really destructive logging period was really destructive, but you can only chop so many trees down using an axe and a crosscut saw. It wasn't big, massive timber harvest plans that happened after World War II when they brought the bulldozers and the chainsaws into the forest. That's when the forest really started getting hammered. Maybe in a slightly more friendly way around the rivers and creeks, since they weren't hauling them right down the rivers. But the salmon were still able to swim up through the log jams and the crap that was part of the very early logging days until the bulldozers and the chainsaws covered every square inch of the forest. And at that point, that's when the salmon totally collapsed here and have really no chance of coming back as an area-wide phenomena until you rebuild the creeks and the forest habitat right around it.
Okay, so I think you talked about this in the last episode about actually yourself helping to redirect some of the flows of the rivers.
Right.
And so the mass cutting that happened with the kind of mechanized logging industry, are you saying that it was that behavior that then affected the flow of the water because the root systems and all the kind of infrastructure that the forest created was the thing that was instructing the river where to flow, or was it something else that was causing that?
You know, two things I think of. One is that people cutting trees wanted to cut every tree that they could cut right down to the creeks and rivers.
Yes.
So let's take 100% of them while we're in there. And the other thing was, so that then affected the temperature of the water. There's no onto and salmon and steelhead are both pretty cool water fishes. They don't like hot sun bearing down on the water. And the other thing was all of the logging, they had this philosophy of going in and clearing out everything out of the creek bottoms and river bottoms. So the early ones, they were doing it because they were dragging the logs out to the rivers and down the river systems to the sawmills at the ocean. And then later, when the bulldozers were in there, they were just bulldozing everything out of the rivers and the creeks just to be doing it, just because they thought that was a better way to manage their forest, which was exactly, so in that process, what they call it, large woody debris, so large logs that had laid in the creeks, especially the creeks more than the big rivers, that would dam off the creek and the water would flow over it or around it or something, but they would the big large woody debris created a lot of pools and ponds and really deep water.
Yes.
And also held all the gravel and rocks and boulders in the creeks. And so once all the large woody debris was taken out, then the rains here in the winter just washed everything out to the ocean. So there's not nearly as much rock and gravel in the creeks now that there was historically. And so somewhere the starting point is to start letting trees live along the rivers and creeks until they reach their natural maturity and fall over and put large woody debris back in the creek. There's the water volume here is very, very small, even right after a rain. It all just flows out to the ocean rather than being held back in deep pools.
So it seems like there would be less flooding then because of that quicker flow, which I can imagine why people in the past might have been wanting. Okay, we don't want flooding. Flooding's bad.
No, I don't think it would have flooded because you're mostly talking right around maybe if you have a little homestead right on a creek or something. I don't see that it would be much more flooding. I don't think so.
Okay. Well, it was thank you for elaborating on that thought. It was good. It was nice to go on that journey with you.
Yeah. So I try to bring my life's passion that started as a child to being part of my life's work, what I speak out for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes absolute sense for that to be part of your experience and part of your journey and motivation, right? It's kind of intuitive, I think. I've got one other little story that I thought would be a fun thing to ask you about, which a friend of yours told me at the previously mentioned apple pressing day, that you had a very close encounter with a buffalo not so long ago, just a few years ago, I believe.
Oh, yes.
Which I thought you told me when we were there. That was a very good story. Would you mind telling that story again?
Well, it goes back in the first interview. I talked about my wife, Kay, and I both had this childhood fantasy of someday seeing the Great Slave Lake and the Mackenzie River. And so 2 summers ago, we drove up to Alaska. I think I said that. And we went to Great Slave Lake and kayaked in Great Slave Lake. And while we were there, then Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada is southeast of Great Slave Lake, about 250 miles on a dirt road, mostly dirt road, and there the wood buffalo is forest buffalo. So buffalo in North America were not only Great Plains animals, but forest animals in Canada. And when almost all of them got shot and extirpated from the 48 states, then the largest number of buffalo left in North America were the woodland buffalo in Canada. And that's still I think the largest reservoir of wild roaming buffalo. I'm pretty sure, because you can drive for hundreds of miles without fences and see buffalo all the way along there.
I had no idea.
And they're just on the sides of the road, mostly in groups of anywhere from singles, doubles, but lots and lots of groups of 20, 30, 40, 50 animals, bulls and cows and calves, and making wallows in the road, and they love to live. Canada keeps the sides of the road cleared way back 100 feet off to the sides of the road. I think to make it safer that people are driving and you don't have big animals running out of the forest right next
It's like
to
jumping
the car.
out. Okay, yeah, you see them coming.
And you really notice that in Canada, that their borders on each side of the road across all of driving up to Alaska is much broader than once you get into Alaska or before you get into Canada. And so the buffalo like that road area because the sun gets down to the earth more and melts the snow, and so there's some vegetation there in the early spring, which was when we were driving up there. So lots and lots of buffalo along the road, and lots of bears too, especially black bears, down eating vegetation. And so then there's lots of good soil to make wallows in. So, but anyway, back to the we got into Wood Buffalo National Park, and there was one campground there, big campground, probably had maybe 60, 80 slots in it. There was only one other young couple from there camping that night, and there were two rangers in the park that we noticed that were trying to haze black bears that were in the park because they were a little threat to the campers. We'd spent a lot of time around black bears living at Twin Lakes, and we felt pretty comfortable with that. We saw 2 black bears driving into the campground. Didn't think much about it. And we saw a couple bison driving in there. But in the morning, we're sleeping on the ground in our tent, maybe 30, 40 feet away from our Subaru. And there's this noise, this grunting and this noise happening. So I peeked my head out of the tent, and there's we thought it was probably a black bear trying to get into the car.
Yes.
So I peeked out of the tent and turned my head over towards the Subaru, and there was a big bull walking just on the far side of the Subaru, walking down the lane there. And so I started to pull back in, and I could see Kay was all in alarm, and she was trying to whisper and not talk very loud, but telling me that there's something really big right next to the tent on the other side of the tent. And she could see it through the little vinyl window in the tent. And so I peeked back out of the door, and I'm just on my knees, and closer than right at where our little tie cords tied onto the ground, the buffalo's walking that close. I mean, not out beyond those, but as close as that I could have reached it with my kayak paddle, certainly, even one half of the kayak paddle. And I had never thought about what you would do if you're having a close encounter with a buffalo. I thought about that with a bear. Anyway, I just reacted without thinking. I was going physically for my bear spray, my big can of pepper spray.
Yeah.
But I needed something faster than that. So I just let out this big yell. And before the yell even reached in that nanosecond between releasing it and it being received, it was like, oh, damn, was that the right thing to be doing here? But I couldn't draw it back. And the buffalo just bolted, but only like a bolt, just maybe 10 feet or so. And then it ran maybe, 20 feet or so. That was enough. And so I pulled back into the tent, and then right away I could hear this, both of us, we heard this big thrashing, and opened the door of the tent again, and the bull that had walked closest by the tent was laying on the ground 30 feet away from the tent, and the buffalo that had walked by the car, which was a really big bull, had knocked it off of its feet.
Whoa.
Had clobbered it. And, you don't even see that when they're really seriously in the rut and butting each other, mostly because both of them are coming on head to head, and one of them may falter and shake, but you don't see them knock each other completely down on the ground, which was what was happening there. And then there was a third buffalo standing there too, all 3 bulls. And I mean, it was a little too much for us. We're like, let's get out of here. And so we ran with me and my skivvies and ran over to the car, and it's freezing outside, and so we're sitting there just in minimal clothes and started the car. We didn't drive anywhere, just sat there and watched the buffalo for a little while. They resumed their browsing and resumed their life there, and one of them was standing, I don't know, maybe 50 feet away from us when we got out of the tent the next morning, and we were pretty comfortable putting our tent away and having breakfast there with it sitting right there next to it.
Having its breakfast.
It was really fun, but it was like just that we had so little experience at that range of buffalo that it was really startling to have that one knock the other one off of its feet right there. Yeah.
I bet you kind of heard the power of the impact as well. You may not have seen it, but like that, I can imagine that amount of body hitting another body.
Had to have been, yeah. Yep.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Must have been a bit scary as well.
It was a little frightening. Yeah. Just like, where are we? We're definitely not in our element here.
Which I think in some ways is part of the fun. At least for me, that's when I feel most alive, is when I'm kind of not in my element.
Yeah, for sure. I feel that the very most when I'm hiking with the least people, but especially when I'm solo hiking. I am present.
Yeah.
I am just present. And I love that. You could say I'm alive.
Yeah.
And there's nothing like that to me. I just love that feeling.
It's interesting you say that, because some of the stuff that I read in your book, The Handcrafted Life of Dick Proenneke, it sounds like you share some of that feeling, in the sense that Dick Proenneke spent many, many years on his own in his cabin and at Twin Lakes. But by no means was he, or do you strike me as someone who is kind of on their own, or kind of prefers to be in their own company all the time. You enjoy having conversations and enjoy being around people, but still being able to be, I think the expression that Dick uses, like being comfortable in your own company is a whole thing, right? Like I feel like it's almost a skill to learn. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you don't really know. I mean, Dick talked about his going out there. He wanted to build that cabin and see if he could put up with his own company for a year.
Yes.
That was he wanted to test himself. And Dick was not a hermit. I really like, people come out and think about Dick as being a hermit, coming to see his cabin. He really liked people. Kay and I like to say Dick really liked people to come out there, and he also liked it when they left. And very frequently, especially those ones that weren't exactly right for Dick, he would always rake his beach. That was his cleaning the footprints off of his beach, and that was his way of reclaiming his space,
getting rid of the evidence, resetting. It's a good.
But he really was a people person too.
Yes, and the many letters and things that he wrote. We'll talk more about that, but he would write many letters actually to you, but also to many people that visited him, friends, family,
anybody.
Yeah, that was kind of his way of living vicariously through other people's experiences too. I think you talked a little about that in the last episode. But this episode, going to talk a bit more about Dick Proenneke's life and your life as well, and how they kind of intertwine in some ways. But I guess we should perhaps set up a little bit. We did this last time as well, but Dick Proenneke, if you don't know him, he is a homesteading, I guess, of some legendary status. He spent over 30 years living on his own in a self-built cabin, built entirely with hand tools, at Twin Lakes in Alaska. He also,
by his own words, maybe 19 of those years the year round.
yes, okay, right. And he also journaled heavily. I think, what was it, 7,000 pages you said that you had access to in writing of the book?
Were transcribed and typed in a fairly medium type.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot. Right. That sounds like a big job. So you first met Dick in the early 80s after the enormous hike that you did.
Right.
That's by my description. That big adventure to walk over to him. And you stayed in touch with him through years with the letters that you exchanged. I guess in some ways, obviously you connected through the way that you talked about each other's lives through the letters that you wrote, but also you must have gained a much better understanding of how he lived his life once you actually went up to Twin Lakes and worked 19 summers as a caretaker. You must have experienced some of his thought processes and his choices and the tools that he decided to make and the solutions that he came up with. Did you feel that immediately as soon as you arrived?
You know, it's a little hard to remember what I thought when I arrived, how much awareness and how much I've thought since then and created a narrative around that fits. There was certainly a feeling, and the first year I went out there and I restored the roof, took the sod off and put a lot of new around the entire perimeter of his roof, put new little, I call them logs, they were poles, 3-4 inch diameter poles for the fascia and gable ends, and there was just an initial awareness that everything that Dick, he didn't take a bunch of his stuff with him. It was all there.
Okay.
There was a whole lot of stuff. I didn't know what it was, but there was just stuff around. And in his cabin and in his woodshed and leaning up against trees here and there, an old shovel that has a metal fatigue crack in it, and just all this stuff. And I knew that Dick had a lot of visitors, and I presume, and we, even that first year, we maybe had 200 people, 250 people came out there that summer. Half of them came out there to see Dick. They didn't know that he wasn't going to be there.
Oh, wow.
So there was that shock for people and for us to deal. They didn't want to see us.
Wow, sharing that news.
Yeah, and sharing that news. But so there was an awareness that Dick's cabin was going to live on, and I had a part of that. I was asked, what do you think? What should we be doing with, how should we restore the roof that first year? How much of the roof should come off? I was given pretty carte blanche. It was more recommended that I take the entire roof off and replace the ridgepole and the purlin and the top logs of the walls to get rid of the rot that was at the end of those. And so that was something, and the person recommending that was the chief historical architect for the National Park Service in Anchorage, who had gone out there, and really, really wonderful person, really good sense about him. When I went out there, then I didn't know what I was going to do for the restoration of the roof. But I could see that replacing those pieces, even with the greatest care that I could do, would be really disruptive to Dick's log work and his craftsmanship. Even if I could match the craftsmanship, it's still not Dick's.
Yes.
How do we keep Dick there? And that became my overriding thing was how do I keep Dick there? How do I keep this place in a way that any visitor coming out there can know Dick as much as humanly possible with what they are handling and seeing. And, there wasn't any greater, there was a little guest book written there. I think my favorite one of all was somebody that came out there a few years after we were there, and said that they came in and Dick wasn't there, but it felt like, that the stove was going and that he was up Hope Creek taking a walk and that he was still there. Dick's presence was still there for that person, and that was probably as good a compliment as I received out there, and I held to that. I didn't know the first year that I would be returning the second year. I didn't make any commitments. I didn't really have a thought about that until being out there, and it's like, oh yeah, this would be a really, really pretty amazing thing to come back a second year. And there was no way that I really contemplated coming back for 19 seasons, and that more happened because Kay was there with me, that it was something we did together.
So it seems like there is again more overlap in the sense that Dick also came for this adventure that he thought was going to be a year. That was his challenge, right? Like, oh, can I go to Twin Lakes, set up a cabin and live for a year? And what will that be like? And then that ended up being a very long period of time. So I want to go back to that at some point, but I do want to now ask you about Kay, because we led into that at the end of last episode. And I'd love to hear the story of how you met. And that wasn't the first year, was it, that you were there, or was it?
It was, right?
Okay, it was
I
the
went
first
up
year.
there in 2000. Kay had actually been at Twin Lakes before and met Dick also.
Okay.
I think 1995, she and a botanist had spent maybe a week or two across the lake from Dick, inventorying the plants of Lake Clark National Park for the park. And Dick had canoed over, and the botanist knew Dick, but Kay hadn't, and she saw this old man canoeing over and asked who he was, and Phil had told her, and then Dick came over there and invited them over to his cabin for some tea, and canoed all three of them over to his cabin, which would have been maybe 2.5 miles each way, and then took a hike with him up to Teetering Rock, up about 45-minute walk away from his cabin, up on the side of the hill where there's a giant boulder, maybe 8 feet long and 4 feet high or so, that teeters, and you can stand up on top of it and teeter it back and forth.
Wow.
It's pretty impressive. And so Kay and Dick had gone up and climbed his ladder and got some little treats out of his cache then, and invited Kay to use one of his walking sticks. So there's all these things that happened for Kay there that became part of that personal way of talking about Dick when she's giving tours years later. Anyway, by the time Dick took them back over there, then the lake was rough and whitecapping with three of them. And so Kay really hated to see Dick go back to his cabin. And but Dick didn't sit back in the back. He knelt in the middle of the canoe, and he didn't try to go to his cabin. He went down lake, and the lake's maybe 1.5 miles wide or so, and then Glacier Creek, where Kay and Phil was up lake from Dick, and the wind was blowing down the lake, so Dick, rather than trying to cut across to his cabin, just let the wind carry him and hit the shore maybe a mile or mile and a half below his cabin and hiked up to his cabin, and then he would have gone back down and picked it up when the wind wasn't blowing. And so Kay was very concerned about him, but here was this old man that was still out there and knew how to do it. And then reading his journals, and that was Dick's life too. He frequently went across the lake and climbed up the mountain to film doll sheep or brown bears or something, and the lake would be awful coming back. That's Twin Lakes. That's where you live. And
so he would have been about 75 or 80 at that time?
Yeah, he would have been 70. He was...
if it was around 95.
Yeah, he was born in 1916, I think. Yeah, so...
Yeah.
Maybe... what's that?
So 16... 95.
79.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, is that right?
69. Math. Wait, we can figure it out.
I think
Let's figure it out.
Yeah, it's almost 80.
So wait, so 95
to 1916.
79. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, so Kay met him there, and then in 1999, he didn't come back out to spend those last few years. During the wintertime, he would typically go into Port Allsworth, the nearest town nearby, and take care of somebody's lodge in there for at least a few weeks, part of the winter. And then in 1999, he didn't come back out to his cabin. So the Park Service had Kay come in there and Phil and use that as their base camp for a few weeks, inventorying plants. And then when Dick didn't come back in 2000, the handwriting was on the wall that Dick was retiring from Twin Lakes, and that's when they asked Kay to come up there, not to inventory plants, but to meet people coming in there. And, so we had a lot to do with Kay got there before I got there in 2000, and the ranger that flew her in dropped her off at Dick's cabin and suggested that she stay in Dick's cabin. That was the only one that the other cabins were storage cabins by then. They weren't great. They were much messier and weren't as good a places to stay. But Kay, even the first day, it's like, this is Dick's house. This isn't her house. And she put a tent right outside of his cabin and stayed there until she cleaned out the Spike's cabin, we call it, where Spike and Hope Crothers, the friend of Dick Proenneke's that first invited Dick up there to Twin Lake, she cleaned that cabin out for her to stay in. And that's where she was by the time, a few days after she had gotten there, when I came up there with my 10-year-old daughter, my 10-year-old child, and Kay met us. There weren't any romantic sparks between Kay and me that first summer. Elon and I spent the summer, that month, in Hope's cabin, the cabin near Spike's cabin. Mm-hmm. And it was the second year that I went up there. Then Elon was not with me that summer, and so Kay and I got together, and then at the end of that summer, then Kay came down here to visit me, and we've been together ever since. And she's just so. I think more about something. When I think of Kay, I think of my marriage to her. That wasn't part of my vows, but it was what I definitely said to myself as my own vow. Yeah. And that was that I would keep going to Twin Lakes as long as Kay wanted to go up there. That was my commitment to her and to myself. And then the other thing I really remember is every year flying into Twin Lakes, and as the plane would bank over the mountains into the Twin Lakes drainage, and I would typically be sitting in the front of the airplane with the pilot with my video camera, and I would turn the video camera around each year and film Kay as we're flying into Twin Lakes. And just seeing, her spirit just soared. She just loved going to Twin Lakes and the wildness of it, and the animals, and the whole, all of Twin Lakes. Both of us were really connected to it, but this was not something that she did for her husband.
Yes. It's quite, I think, a powerful thing if it's the two of you are both so passionate about this one thing. It's not necessarily one or the other agreeing to go along just because the other one is super passionate about something, which is a very common thing in happy relationships. But the fact that you're both so passionate and so driven about the same thing is...
Yeah, and we were both very, very passionate about keeping Dick's legacy alive. The the guides that came out there the last year or 2 or 3 that we were out there would say, Kay is like an ever-ready battery. She never runs out of juice, and she had as much enthusiasm for her giving tours to people as she did the very first years. And both of us had a passion for Dick Proenneke, but maybe I think both of us had even a greater passion for wildlife and wilderness than we did for Dick Proenneke. Taking care of Dick's cabin was just a privilege of my lifetime, but it was also a avenue for getting into the wilderness all those years.
And I remember you telling some great stories from the last episode about watching animals for long, long periods of time.
Yeah.
Being in that environment must have been fantastic.
Yeah.
So do you mind if we jump? We're maybe probably going to naturally jump around a few different spots now, but if we could go back, I think I gave this foreshadow just a second ago, if I'm remembering correctly. But if we can go back to Dick's kind of early days at Twin Lakes, but also, and I know that your book is more specifically about the cabin and Twin Lakes and the tools that he created there. But I think it would be fun to hear a little bit of what you know about his early days before he actually came to Twin Lakes. I've got a few notes here about some of the things that he got up to. I'm just looking for my notes now. So, yeah. Did you say before? Go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, Dick grew up in Primrose, Iowa, farming community, and his dad was, I think they farmed, but his dad was also painted houses and drilled well with an old cable, an old drilling rig for getting water to irrigate with. So that was his background.
So how does that work? Sorry, I'm trying to visualize. So a well, as in just drilling straight down for a well, is that right?
Right.
But you said with a cable?
I'm not sure. There may have been a process. I think there was a process that it was horse driven.
Oh.
And riding, having the horse go in circles, it actually drilled down. But I'm not positive about that. The old cable thing was a thing that had had a derrick that was set up above the well, and the early ones would have been wood.
Yes.
What I was familiar with in my childhood were mostly metal ones, and the cable was a cable that dropped, just thundered down, just dropped down, and then it would winch back up and drop down.
Okay,
and they would keep water down there to make a slurry.
Okay, yes.
And then they had a mechanism, a bucket thing that would pick up that loose muck down at the bottom and bring it all the way to the top. And
interesting.
Yeah.
I can visualize it now that you're saying that the timing of the thing going up and then dropping. I think I've seen that in some video or film somewhere. So it sounds like Dick came from an environment of people that were pretty hands-on, able to make things work in a very practical way.
Exactly.
Because part of my wanting to talk to you is sort of understanding some of the background of how Dick was able to go into this very wild environment and feel comfortable enough to create tools of a huge variety, and solve problems probably every day, I would assume.
Yep. All the way up to the point when he got his 2 different movie cameras and his exact slide camera. He was making inventions for those, for taking, snapping at it, doing whatever he needed to do, and repairing them.
Yeah, you can't send it to the repair shop easily.
Not very easily.
That's bonkers. Yeah. So was he himself, did he, when he grew up, become a repairman of some kind? I think that's correct, or was that?
He did. He first came up to Alaska wanting to be a cattle rancher on Kodiak Island.
Okay.
And looked into doing that, and never really did that. And then after years, he did do maintenance work. I know that he came out and was the maintenance person out for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out in Bristol Bay and king salmon, where my early years of counting fish were. That there was stories of Dick Proenneke being part of that, and I don't really know much about that.
Yeah.
It's not written about, but his name came up there. He became a diesel mechanic and heavy equipment operator in Kodiak. After the earthquake in '64, there was a fishing boat, I think a 32-foot fishing boat that had been washed inland several miles and across swamp and through the forest, and the guy that owned it still wanted the boat and hired Dick for, I don't know, $1,500 or something, and Dick got a young man to help him and had a little D4 cat dropped off with a boat on the beach of Kodiak someplace. And,
I've seen pictures in the book.
Yeah, pull that thing out. Just amazing what he could do. Yeah. And so he did a lot of maintenance work, and I know he equipment operator, so bulldozers and road graders and stuff. And the part that really relates to him going to Twin Lakes, he was so before the days of ball bearing, there were Babbitt bearings, and
yes.
I'm not in, and I don't think I told this story before.
You didn't? No, it's an important part.
It was pouring lead into the where you would later have a ball bearing, and having that lead in there, and you can always tell a Babbitt bearing because there's a little oil drip thing outside of the motor sitting somewhere around that people maintaining the motor running are pouring that thing full of oil all the time, because it's the oil going down on the Babbitt that keeps the shaft running smoothly.
Yes.
And not wearing. If it's lead, then it's not very hard, and so it needs lots of lubrication. So Dick was pouring Babbitt, and so liquid lead, hot lead,
molten, yeah.
And he thought he had all the water out of the shaft where he was pouring it into, and it wasn't. So when the lead hit that water, it exploded and blew the lead back out of the hole and all over Dick's face, and he was blind for a while, and then slowly regained his vision. And
how long was he blind for?
It sounded like, he could. I'm sort of guessing from what I read that he was able to move around and take care of himself after that, but not really have. One eye was worse than the other. That it was months and months before his vision came back, and maybe years before it really came back to him. But it seemed like he had good vision during his time at Twin Lakes. But it was soon after that that he sort of said it. If I can see again, I want to live my life. And his image of living his life was this fantasy, this idea of going out into the wilderness and building a cabin and putting up with his own company for a year. That was his challenge. That was his he didn't think about it for the rest of his life, but that was going to be the first stage.
Yes.
And I don't think I told you that we had a woman who was a real young mother near Primrose when Dick first started going up and started building his cabin in 68, 69. Dick's parents were real old then. So after Dick had spent the first winter at his cabin, then the next few winters until his parents passed away, he would go back to Primrose and take care of them in the winter. And while he was back there, he brought slides from Twin Lakes. I don't think he showed movies. I think it was slides. He had taken movie of building his cabin with the 8mm Bolex, but I don't think it was edited.
Yeah.
And so this woman who was a young, it sounds like almost a teenage mother at that time, she said the slideshows were in the basement of a church, the local church there, and they were adventure stories. They were Dick on an adventure. And she said within a very few years that the flair of Dick's message there changed from being an adventure story to one of being a person who cared for the wilderness and the animals, and sort of a different philosophy.
Yes.
Than being the master of conquering everything.
Being part of nature.
And she brought that up to me as a visitor at Dick's cabin years after Dick had died. She wanted to tell us that, and I thought that was really interesting, that transition of in Dick. And it fit totally with Dick shooting a sheep that first winter for meat, or first fall.
Yes.
And being proud of that, and having been a hunter probably all of his life, but certainly all of it time in Kodiak, and coming out to Twin Lakes intending to do that, and then not hunting again. That he had a different relationship with those animals than one of him being the hunter.
Yes. You said to me before, and I can't remember if it was in the last conversation we had being recorded, but he became more of an opportunist. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a good way.
So because he still ate meat, right?
He still ate meat, and people brought most of the meat he ate after. I would say most of it was fish.
Okay.
He always would walk down the beach to Hope Creek, which is maybe 3 minutes walk from his cabin. He said there was always a fresh fish in the refrigerator there, and he did kill porcupines that were gnawing on his cabin, on his door. He didn't always kill them. Sometimes he would catch them and put them in his canoe and canoe them across to the other side of the lake. But he did kill some porcupines, and they're good eating.
They're quite fatty, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah.
But they make a nice roast or a stew. Yeah.
So is it just a matter of him enraged at the nibbling critter?
Yeah.
They can't move very fast, can they?
They do move fast.
Oh, do they?
Yes. They can run as fast as we can run. through the wilderness.
Wow.
Just about, I would say, right at our speed.
Interesting.
You can keep up with one. You can keep it there, but you can't really easily overrun it. Yeah.
I would have assumed that given the defensive strategy of a porcupine would mean that it hasn't developed fast speed, but that's that's interesting that they're actually quick.
And we can't run real fast.
I guess compared to everything else, we're slow. Yeah. True.
So, and then Dick would get quarters of moose or chunks of meat from other people who would hunt. And once in a while, Dick would assist somebody that would come out there. I don't think Dick ever really became philosophically opposed to hunting. But he really didn't like people coming out there and shooting sheep for the horns or moose for the antlers. And leaving the rest.
Just leaving the carcass.
He really didn't like that. And I read, I know that he salvaged sheep from people who would leave, just take the cape and the horns and maybe a backstrap or something out of a sheep. And he would be able to see, he would know who was camped on the lake. It's 6 miles long and 1.5 miles wide, and from near his cabin you can see from one end to the other, and you can hear the airplanes coming in, or if they brought a little raft with a motor on it, he would know that was there. And so he would know when people went up in the mountains hunting. And one of the really, really good spots, one of the best spots, is right across the cabin, right across the lake from his cabin. And so he would actually see them shoot a sheep and know pretty much where it was.
Yeah.
And go up there the next day and salvage all the meat he could from it.
Yeah. Then it's, I'm guessing at that time it was maybe more common, the idea of just kind of trophy hunting and in its kind of conventional way, just taking things for the sport, I guess.
And he really didn't like, there were actually people that would see him canoeing on the lake and stop and in their float plane and stop and ask him, where's the big bull or where's the big ram? And he really disliked that.
Did he ever give them misinformation?
I never really, I told you, I searched through the books when I wrote my book using terms.
Yeah.
And so I didn't read all 7,000, but I didn't ever read where he gave people misinformation.
We'll never know. So, I seem to have got my pages muddled up. Bear with me a second. Okay, here we go. So you said before about the Babbitt bearings and the explosion that took his sight, but in a way kind of opened his eyes, if we're going to continue that metaphor, to a life that he actually wanted to try and live, at least for a year. But reading through your book as well, I was really fascinated by some of the story of him in that first, I guess, 10 weeks of building his cabin.
Yeah.
It was really kind of fun to read through that. And I think it was in 68. I believe that he was there in 67 in the summer.
Cut
then
his logs.
Prepped a bit and then came back and blasted through. Admittedly, it wasn't, by his account, what I'm reading, it wasn't finished after 10 weeks, but it was certainly livable at that point.
It was pretty finished. His cabin was finished in 68.
Okay.
Along with all of his furniture.
Yes, right. So I guess in those 10 weeks, he moved what sounds like he had 150 pounds of gear that he got dropped off with, and then moved that 4 miles over to the site that he decided was going to be a good spot for where the cabin sits now. Mm-hmm. And then apparently worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I would say 7 days a week. He really worked every day on his cabin until I think one of the very first times that he took off, which wasn't a full day, was when he heard some wolves howling and went up Hope Creek to investigate some wolves. And
Yeah.
yeah, so he worked every day, unless then later he would be out doing something in picking berries or doing something else. Yeah, he didn't really take a day off per se.
And he'd never, although we talked about him being very practical in his upbringing and surrounded by people who were perhaps problem solvers, he wasn't ever a homesteader per se before he came to Twin Lakes, was he? Did he have a history
No.
of homesteading?
No,
No.
and he didn't really. I don't think he ever really intended to be a homesteader. I think he really wanted this experience of building his cabin and living there one year, and so he thought of it more as I think that land was open to. It was federal land, and it was open to home sites and recreation sites. And Dick had stopped into Anchorage, and on his way up there in '67 to the I think it was Bureau of Land Management land,
Okay.
and asked about it and about home sites and recreation sites, and the person had told him that it was open. And so he went out there in '67 and cut his logs, and he stopped by that same office on his way south in '67, back to Kodiak, I presume, and was told that no, it really wasn't open, that they had closed all of the state of Alaska to doing any home sites or recreation sites or homesteads until they figured out the native land claims. And because what happened in that interim was that the year before, oil was discovered on the North Slope, and the state was a pretty new state. I think it became a state only in '59 or so.
Okay.
And so, and at that point, then the state was saying, we want some it was all federal land. So this new state is saying they want control of some of that land, and native groups and people were saying this has always been native land. So the feds hadn't done anything about that until oil was discovered on the North Slope, and then they realized we're going to have to settle all this, and the first thing we're going to do is stop giving away land in any form. And Dick got caught in that. In fact, so much so that the person that talked to him in the spring of '67 didn't know it had already been closed. So Dick knew when he came out there in '68 that he was going to be squatting
Yes,
on
that's the
federal
word.
land
Yeah.
illegally. And since he was just wanting to do it just to take pictures and stay there one winter, he's like, nobody's even going to see me out here.
Yes.
I'm going to get by. And then by the time they were considering making a national park, then federal people coming out into that area started seeing Dick and offered to give Dick to upgrade. He had filmed his cabin building with an 8mm Bolex. They offered him a 16mm Bolex to take film to promote that country as a national monument.
Interesting.
And I'm not sure exactly why. Dick didn't ever get that camera. His brother, Raymond, who bought the 8mm camera for Dick, bought Dick a 16mm movie camera. So the camera was actually Dick's. But he then the National Park Service did send Dick, it sounds like, all the slide film and the movie film that he wanted. And so he spent a lot of time I think of it especially in 74, 75, probably 73, filming for the National Park Service, because that's when his brother flew a little Super Cub up there, and the two brothers spent one summer flying around camping, taking film and stuff that was used to promote all of that lake country as part of Lake Clark National Monument.
Wow, it's pretty lucky.
And so then the Park Service then created a movie called One Man's Alaska, which was the first film of using Dick's film. And I think that came out in 76, I think.
That's a nuance of the story that I didn't know, and it's incredibly lucky, I guess, that someone who was involved in that system had the vision to see the potential in having someone there on site capturing footage and being motivated to do that. Because I can really see, even perhaps back in that time, someone being like, no, this isn't the rules. You need to get out.
Oh, there were lots of people. Yeah. And there was that. Nobody wanted the trappers and the guides that were going up there hunting, didn't want to get rid of their cabins at all.
Yes.
There were, 2 trappers' cabins, 4 trappers' cabins, and maybe 3 hunting cabins on Twin Lakes. And people, and they just refused to acknowledge the change of status. And so there were people that got caught and prosecuted over hunting in the park and continuing to. And I think that would have been true all across the state of Alaska. Yes. And the Park Service offered, I can't remember, like maybe 10 or 12, quite a few people across the state move cameras and provide them film to promote different areas in inclusion in the National Park Service.
Interesting.
And there was a comment where somebody coming up to see Dick told Dick that there wasn't anybody coming close to doing what Dick was doing. So Dick was the biggest advocate of using that equipment, even though it was his camera.
Huh. That's so interesting.
And he was mixed too. He was not somebody that really liked government people. It was always a mixed blessing for him. Yeah.
I guess he's got a reason to keep a wary eye out, I guess. I have a little thing here, a little note of something I read that he wrote in his journal about, and I think this speaks a bit to the change that you mentioned that he went through those first few years. Because in some of his writings, he mentioned that he was planning to get a chainsaw and continue his homesteading with more larger motorized equipment. But that didn't end up being the case, right? Like he was, apart from just a couple of things.
It's interesting that that's true, that he had planned on, he made a comment in there of getting a chainsaw and using that to build his cabin. And so Dick didn't really just all of a sudden formulate exactly what he was going to be doing out there. We had a man come up there whose father owned the hardware store in Kodiak during Dick's time. And that man, closer to my age, said that his dad frequently told the story of Dick coming in and buying a few of the hand tools that he used out there and trying to sell Dick a chainsaw, and Dick wouldn't have it. So that was right before, in 68, right before Dick went out there, Dick had made that decision that he could do it with hand tools.
Interesting.
And there were the windows there. So there were several windows in Weiser, another cabin there that a guy, a hunter, had built this little cabin up the lake from Dick's. Had never even used it, had never even cleared the wood chips out of it. Once the cabin was built, then he never returned to hunt there even. But there were several frames, wooden frames with a single glazed piece of glass with mullions in between those glasses, the windows that were so common way back when. And those window frames fit the openings in Dick's cabin. And they weren't new. So they had been painted, and then the paint had worn off. So those were and those were windows that Dick knew the measurements of and had scheduled to come out to make windows in his cabin. So when he made his openings in his cabin, they were for those windows that hadn't yet arrived, and he used some mylar over his windows. And he told a lot of people that the mylar didn't frost up as much as glass. So he said that, but I see quite a few things at Dick's cabin that somewhat this building by hand and making decisions and making do with what's out there, I think had a life of its own for Dick, that he took pride in that, and that my guess those windows with the glass in it may have served Dick. I don't want to counter him and say that they would have functioned better than his mylar windows. I know that Dick was proud of his windows that he made himself with the little mullions. And the bear went through it once, and I had to replicate that. And so now that window's my window. And it was really, really special to see Dick's craftsmanship and his working with these little tiny pieces of wood, these little strips, making the mullion inside and out for mylar. And I'm just tickled that he thought that way. But
can I just move one thing? I think you just tapped your mic slightly. Yeah. I can hear it slightly quieter.
Some man that owns the cabin across the lake from Dick used to apparently, he told that guy Gary Titus told me that he used to try to get Dick to put a skylight in his cabin, and Dick would never have it, never do it. And Dick's cabin is dark.
Yeah,
it's pretty dark in there. And Dick and I'm not positive that Dick said this, but Gary told me that at one point finally that Dick had said that a skylight isn't what people expect me to have. And I think for sure that even if that was or wasn't true, that there was a part of Dick that created this image of how he lived that first year. And then once the book, the One Man's Wilderness, was edited out of Dick's journals of the first 2 years, then it became a classic up there, and people knew Dick and knew of him and started coming out to see Dick. Not a lot of people, but some.
Yeah.
And And they certainly would have had an image of who Dick was. Jay Hammond had an image of who Dick was that I bought in, that I got really fascinated with, and who built his own hinges for his door and everything else.
Yeah.
And so there was a part of Dick, I know, that Dick created this world, this image, and then he lived into it.
It's like
and
a
he
standard
lived
he had to live
into
up
it
to. Yeah.
partly because that was what people, that he thought that's what people wanted to see when they came out there. I don't see anything wrong with that.
No, it's interesting though.
But it makes, Dick was just this person, this, I don't know, I don't need to say average person. He was just, he was a person living out there, a really neat person that,
I guess it's a story which is inspiring because people can relate to his history maybe and then be like, well, if that's something that he can do, then anyone, not anyone, but like maybe I could do that. It's like a vicarious feeling of potential that can exist because of his story. There was something that I have written here which I thought was an interesting kind of slight contradiction. And it's also, I think you made a good point as well, that Dick didn't, as any of us do, right? We might have the most concrete intentions with our lives, excuse me, but things happen and then plans change. That's just the nature of life, right? So I think Dick going in there and planning the first year to just be about his adventure and then realizing that he was becoming part of the wilderness there, and also not wanting to impose on that wilderness too much, became part of his story as well. And I think you said to me before that there were times he was deciding what would happen to his cabin once he'd gone.
right?
He said he wanted it to rot into the ground, or he might set it on fire, I think, even at some point, if that's correct.
That guy Gary Titus said that that's what Dick had said to him, that he would burn it down someday when he was done. He didn't say that to me, but he did say that he had built it in such a manner that it would settle back into the earth, which wasn't true. I said he had built the rock fireplace.
Right, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, yeah. It's a hefty fireplace.
Yeah, it is. And it ended up not to even function really well. It smoked a little, so Dick didn't use it a lot. Dick certainly cleaned out. We had people come in there that said that Dick had his National Geographic stored in a little shelf across the bottom of his fireplace, and then I know that he had an insulated cover over the front of it sometimes. No, that's one of those incongruous parts of Dick that didn't quite fit. But, when you think of him not coming out there without a chainsaw and stuff, then there was a little motor to his canoe, which Dick didn't import. Mm-hmm. That canoe belonged to Spike Crothers, who became ill when Dick came out there. And I think Spike and Hope Crothers only came out there one time in 1968 when Dick built their cabin, and that was the last time that they came out there. And then they sold the things, the canoe and the motor and stuff, to Dick. And so Dick inherited that. And he didn't use it a lot, but he did use it. And, Dick's brother flew... I'm not sure who owned the airplane, but I think it was Dick's airplane that his brother rebuilt and flew up there, and then Dick and Raymond flew around the park for one summer, and then Dick crashed that airplane flying back to outside that winter and broke his back, and then had to recover from that. And his brother Raymond got the parts of that airplane back down to Southern California and rebuilt it another time and flew it back up there and sold it to a young Norwegian pilot that used to be one of the guides that would come in, bring clients into Dick's cabin. It was really fun for us to hear about the next life of that plane, and how Raymond's rebuilding of that airplane sounded like just a masterful job of rebuilding it.
Because it was pretty damaged, right? From
Yeah,
what
it
I
was
read.
a total.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like prop bent, like prop strike.
Right.
All parts of it kind of
Just
bent
smashed.
and broken all over the place.
Right.
It must have been a pretty bad impact.
Yeah, into trees, into a forest.
Yeah, lucky. I think I have a little thing that I want to ask you about with that, but I wonder if that's the best time to do it. So, rounding up our kind of thought that we were just talking about with the kind of contradictions of Dick's mission and it kind of changing and what he had as an ideal. There was a point where I think you actually had a conversation with Dick about, and this was later on, closer to the time that Dick was going to leave the cabin, about what he actually wanted to happen to it. Because he wasn't sure, is that right? He was kind of trying to figure out what to do, and I believe that you spoke about it.
You know, Dick, I think it must have been when Kay and I visited Dick in Hemet, California, when he was living with his brother. We went down there.
Okay, so he'd already left the cabin.
Dick asked me, he just asked me, what do you think I should do with my cabin, is exactly how he put it. What should I do with my cabin? And that ended up to be really one of the things that was a guiding thing for me out there, because that would have been maybe after Dick died in 2003. And so that might have been after the first year, 2000 or 2001 season. And I just told him, I just said, I don't know, because at that point, he didn't have title. He never had title to that cabin. And he's too old to go back out there again. So it wasn't up to him what would happen to his cabin.
Yes.
The Park Service was going to do what they wanted to do with his cabin. But I didn't want to say that, and didn't say that. I just said to Dick, I said, I don't know what you should do with your cabin, but I can tell you what your cabin means to me and what your time there means in my life. That it's been a really, really important part of my life. How you lived, and your cabin is a part of that. And that I can't help but think, long after I'm gone, or maybe I said long after you're gone and I'm gone, that your cabin being there will be something that people are really interested in and be inspired by in the similar way that I've been inspired by your life. And that's pretty much how I left that. And, you know, we had that one guy, Gary Titus, across a lake that definitely thought that the cabin nothing should happen to it, that it should be left to rot in the ground or burned or whatever. And we had a few visitors that came out there that had a similar thought, that why are you doing this, that it should just be allowed to sit there the way Dick had it. But Dick, I don't think Dick was ever clear in his journaling what he thought should happen up to his cabin. I haven't read where he was clear what his dreams or hopes were. so I put my own spin on it. I was invited up there to consult with the park and to be involved in the restoration, and I can't imagine anybody having a greater respect or wanting to do the right thing for Dick, but that's always somebody's personal guess or their decision. And just because Dick was such an inspiration to me, including his cabin being there, that I just couldn't help but think that people want, the mass amount of people want that cabin left and kept taken care of. And so my mission was to leave it as close to Dick as I could, and everything I did was aimed at how do I keep everything as exactly like Dick as possible, even though Dick's thing is no longer going to be there, his snow shovel or whatever.
Yeah, and he went to painstaking lengths in order to mimic that and create copies of some of his items, which we can talk about shortly. I'm excited to discuss some of those objects with you.
So I think I have a really clear. I don't feel I don't ever second guess myself about that.
Yeah.
Because eventually Kay and I started saying and thinking, being aware that even the part of me that it comes back to care for Dick's legacy and to be in wilderness and around all this wildlife, Dick became secondary to why I was taking care of his cabin. I started thinking the primary reason I'm caring for Dick's cabin and how I'm caring for Dick's cabin is not Dick. It's the people who come there.
Okay.
I'm doing that for them. And because, coming there for so many people is just, it is their bucket list. It's the thing they want to do. People that, once I wrote this book, and we kept not a list of everybody who came there, but the people that we really spent hours with and talked to a lot, and would sometimes people would say, what's going to happen when you're gone, or are you going to write a book to share what you know about this thing? You have a responsibility to write that book. And so we had a list of maybe 500 or 600 people, and wrote all of those people and let them know. And some people, a lot of letters returned, but a lot of people, and we knew this would happen. A lot of people, we got a letter back from some other member of that family, the wife or the brother, and so-and-so's died. That he died later that year, in fact. That we visited the cabin. That's something they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And for that to mean that much to that many people in a way that Kay and I know how much that meant to people, we got to see it daily. People coming out and getting out of the plane, and a few people would kneel down and kiss the ground, or go of just men that usually the wife would say that he's usually really talkative, but some guy would be there and not say a word for 30 minutes and just in awe, maybe not even go in the cabin, but just standing outside of the cabin, or whatever they did. You could tell the depth of the meaning, what this meant to people. And one of those guys, the woman was there on the beach, and the guy hadn't said anything, and the woman didn't seem to be really involved. And so I'm talking to her and ask her, something about her, and she said that yes, this was our a wedding gift, to a wedding anniversary gift from her to him. And I asked her what she did for a living, and she said she cleaned houses and it costs a lot of money to fly to Dick's cabin.
Yeah.
And so here this woman made this a reality for her husband.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I was there as a person who worked for those people who want to come see Dick's cabin. Not initially,
Yes.
but eventually that's who I was working for.
And that must have been the thing that kept you coming back year after year after year. That responsibility, I guess, as well. Yeah, that's an amazing story. So, something I'm curious about, that first year when you agreed to take the job as caretaker, how did you feel in the space that you'd been 15 years before or something like that, right? When you first met Dick, you were in the cabin and your job was to fix and maintain, and I don't know if you were making duplicates at that point, but were you kind of intimidated at that moment to do everything correctly, or what was your kind of mindset right at the beginning?
I guess that I've had a sense of intimidation about things, but I never let that really get in my way of moving forward. And I was asked to come. The man that John Branson, who hiked with me, that knew the country, that made that hike possible when I met Dick Proenneke in 1982. He was the one that actually called me and asked me if I would come up and consult with the park in 2000. And he said that they didn't ask Dick about that, or he didn't. But the head ranger there had surveyed Jay Hammond's property across the lake, and it knew Jay and Bella Hammond, and Jay had certainly spoken for my abilities to build, and Dick's liking my bridge a lot was at least common knowledge. The bridge became sort of people knew who built that.
Yes.
And that it was a masterful job of log work. And John said that there was a crew from Denali National Park that was being considered to do that work. But he said that he was hoping that I would be interested in doing it. And he said that Lee Fink, the ranger, was in support of that, and he knew that Jay Hammond had spoken for me, and he thought that Dick Proenneke, if he was asked, would certainly want me to be the one involved. So that's how I was chosen to be up there, and then I guess I would have been really intimidated to take the entire roof off of Dick's cabin and start replacing those major logs. I hadn't planned on that amount of time out there. The other thing that was suggested was that I could cut the ends of those logs off. They stuck out from the cabin 3 feet, 3.5 feet, to cut them off right.
Was that the part that was rotting?
And splice that.
Okay.
And that seemed like a pretty invasive thing to do too.
Yeah.
And so once I'd peeled back the roof and looked at those logs, they were not rotted. They were all rotted on the top surface, maybe as deep as 3 inches out of a 8-inch log, maybe even more than that. And it had run back underneath the roof for a foot or 18 inches or so. But the structural integrity of those pieces was still there.
Okay.
And that was the main thing to me. The roof wasn't about to sag and break off there. And I thought, well, you don't, if I make a little copper cap over the top that diverts water away from the top and it never gets wet again, then that should really slow it down tremendously. And that and yet using, and I brought some rolls of copper, several sheets of 3 feet by 10 foot sheets of copper out there with me, which I think were a suggestion of the head historical architect. Because I was going to be going out there and making that decision that I didn't have communication back to then go over what does this look like and then what should we be doing. It was more like, what do you think? And I didn't really have the expertise to do that. Somebody had the faith in me to do that. And it ends up that I was exactly the right person to do that.
Yes.
Because it's I guess you have to have some sort of level of craft, and I have that built into me. Mm-hmm. And what you really need is the integrity, the attitude that you're doing this on this really important cabin, and how do you do it in a way that keeps Dick here?
I think also in a funny way, there's more integrity in the idea of, you may not have been as much of an expert about copper on beams, but the beauty of Dick's story is that he wasn't an expert about many things, but he figured it out and he made his own solutions work really well. So the fact that you were then in his shoes, kind of in that situation, having to use your own wits to solve these problems, feels perhaps what Dick would have wanted anyway.
And it's good you said that, because I started the roof restoration on his woodshed, which had the same problems with the 4-inch logs that were sticking out for supporting the roof were rotted in the same way. And I wanted to do whatever I did on that first.
As a test.
And I thought, what would Dick do for this? And he would use his gas can metal, and he would make a little cap for this now.
Yes.
That's exactly what my thought was, and I used that phrase a lot. What would Dick do?
Yeah.
And so I made the end caps for the logs on the woodshed out of gas can sheet metal, which was going to itself rot out in a few years. And now it has been replaced with copper. And then when I went to his cabin, then I'm like, because what I'm doing to his roof is invasive. Not as invasive as all these other more invasive things, but it's still invasive. And I want my work to last as long as I can have it last. So why not use copper on his cabin, even though Dick would not have used copper? And that was always a dilemma. And I know when Dick came out there later that year, and the copper up on that roof was shiny copper colored. It hadn't gotten its aged patina at that point. And I had some real nervousness because it's a major, major change to the front and the back of Dick's cabin, but especially the front.
Yeah.
Because the butt end of all those major roof logs is in the front of the cabin. So the large diameter and those end caps are they're in your face. And so Dick getting off of the airplane and walking up there was a big, big moment for me. Yeah.
How did he react? Did he say anything?
He looked up and saw them and then turned around and smiled. And that was his comment.
Well, I guess that's better than a frown.
And he didn't mind, because the first thing, we knew he kept his beach rake really well. So Kay had raked his beach before he got there that last time. And I want to tell you, it was raked like a Zen garden. It was really raked really, really nice. There wasn't any spruce cones left sitting on the beach. And Dick, when he stepped out of the plane down onto the float, before he got onto the beach, and his eyes were bad then too, but before he ever stepped onto the beach, he said, "I see you're not keeping my beach raked very good." And so he had that sense of humor, because he was just poking a little.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't afraid to do that. And he could have done something like that to me around the end caps on his logs. And I'm glad he didn't. I'm glad he just smiled.
He decided to be kind on you that day. Kind to you that day. Something which maybe I want to get into some of the objects that you restored in a second, but I guess one thing that I'll do that, but answer it in the format of, because you ask about me being intimidated. Yeah.
The one place that I was really intimidated was the door hinges that he had made, because it has a wooden pin, maybe 5/8 inch wooden pin, 3/4 inch wooden pin going into the barrel of the hinge.
Yes.
And those seem to have worked really well when he first made them, but through all the years, there was a little wear on those to where the door would have been clunking against the door jamb. And Dick went in there and wrapped a little gas can metal, that thin sheet metal, around the pin where he thought it needed it and where it could go in, and that tightened it up for him.
Okay.
And then when we went out there, the door clunked a little bit, but it got worse and worse. And there was a lot of discussion, and here it wasn't just me doing what I thought was best. This was a conversation with the people in Anchorage about, some conversation, do we take Dick's door out of here and I make a new door and hang it and bring this historic door into Anchorage? Or what do we do? And eventually I asked permission one year to just rebuild the hinges.
Which are entirely wooden hinges.
Wooden hinges.
Yeah.
And I didn't want any part of my rebuilding to be visible. I wanted it all to be Dick's. And I thought about that for several years, and especially that winter being back here. And when I first went out there, then I pulled the pins that I could pull and would put paraffin on those, unscented paraffin, so that they would be lubricated nicely and not wear any more than they had to. But one of those pieces of gas can that Dick had put in one had jammed in there to where I was never able to get that pin pulled out. And if I couldn't get that pin pulled out, I couldn't take one door off. So two of the hinges really didn't get waxed until I rebuilt the hinges, which probably was 10 years into our time being there. And so then I not only had to rebuild the hinge, I had to pull that pin out of a door that I had never been able to get the pin out of.
So how did you do it?
So I made a little vise thing that would press it out rather than beat it out, and not put any undue stress on any of the hinge parts to do the pressing. And it worked really beautifully to just push it out, and it came right out. But then I meticulously filed the dowel, the pin, slightly smaller in diameter to where I could wrap gas can metal all the way around that. And I did use gas can metal there. And I epoxied it onto the pin, and I rasped out the barrel of the hinge itself, the female part of the hinge, and wrapped that with gas can metals that was epoxied in. And then I put paraffin in there and left instructions that every couple of years it should be lubricated. And if they need to rethink, what kind of lubrication you use, then good. But it needs lubricated. And if it is lubricated every couple of years, it would last the duration of the cabin.
Yeah.
It'll last
Just metal on metal.
100 years. It'll never wear out and never get sloppy. But that one I couldn't back up on that. It had to work the first time, and it actually went really easily.
Oh, it did?
Yeah, it wasn't a hard thing to do, but I was very nervous, and it brought me to the point of being aware of Dick making the door in the first place, and what a remarkable risk he was taking to have his cabin all built and really care about the craftsmanship, and then deciding to make a Dutch door with two little tiny doors that are barely 2 feet wide, and each one can't quite be 2 feet high, and to hang them on wooden hinges, and then to know that everybody coming into his cabin, once you have those wooden hinges in there, everybody's going to look at them.
Yeah.
And they're going to swing the door. And they're going to operate the latch, too, the little lock and latch. And so your work is right out there. You're asking people to inspect, and they're going to. And Dick would have known that. And then, so the pressure's on.
And then you're feeling the same.
Well, mine was pretty small compared to him doing it in the first place, but I had my own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's great, because that was one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about. The door, because it seems like such an iconic part of the cabin.
It is.
There was another part which I want to ask you. I mean, I've got a list of things here, and also if there's anything that's your favorite or pops into mind, then just shout and send me on the right path.
Like I just did.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, do you mind if we take a little break for a second?
Good.
Yeah,
Perfect.
let's do that. Yes.
Oh, this is fun.
Good. It means I'm having fun as well. Right. Right. That's the first Dick Proenneke as known by Monroe Robinson episode in the meat box. I guess that's the analogy that'll work best. There will be another episode of a similar nature in a few weeks' time, so be sure to give this podcast a follow, just to make sure that you don't miss it. No other reason, obviously. I've said it before, and I'll probably say it a few times again before the end of this episode, but a big thank you to Monroe for sharing his time and his stories and experience with us today. You can find his book, The Handcrafted Life of Dick Proenneke, in a number of different places. I will put some links down in the show notes. The simplest place is to probably go online to Lost Art Press and give that a search on the old Google or however you like to find stuff. As usual, I want to give a big thank you to all the listeners who keep coming back for more nuggets of wisdom and entertainment. And to everyone new, welcome. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a follow, even leave a review if you're feeling generous. Okay. I feel like there's something else I should be saying, but I think that might be it for now. Thanks for listening, and until next time.